Hello and welcome to Music City Murder, a podcast meant to give people an insight into the history behind Nashville's most infamous murders. The show is hosted by author T. Blake Brady. You can find his novels at Parnassus Books in Green Hills, as well as on Amazon. Fans of James Lee Burke's Dave Robichaux series will probably dig these books too. One last thing before we begin. If you like what you hear, be sure to rate and review Music City Murder on the Apple Podcasts app. It's the little purple icon on your phone. Reviews help to distinguish the show from millions of other podcasts out there. A 5-star review is appreciated, but it doesn't matter what you say. No one is sure how it helps, but it definitely does. It has something to do with the algorithm, I think. Anyway, let's get on to the show.
Welcome. As the intro says, you are listening to Music City Murder. This is the second episode of Season 3 of the show. And boy, do I have a doozy for you today. It's a tale of love and drinking and fire and lies and murder. Or is it? I apologize if my voice sounds a bit scratchy. We are recovering in this household from a bout of the flu. Our 4-year-old has gotten both my wife and myself extremely ill. And so we are still on the recovery end of things. I've still got a dry cough. And, little guy's fine. He had his flu shot, and so he was sick for about a day. And my wife and I have been sick for like 2 weeks. So if I'm scratchy and sound like I'm recording, with a gravelly voice, that's why. But anyway, on to the show. My main source for this episode is an in-depth series of articles from The Intercept, written by Liliana Segura. Published in November of 2021, so not too long ago. And it should be noted, this is a case I hadn't heard of before, and it's really, really strange. So I'm excited to dig into it with you. Hope you're as intrigued about it as I am. And let's get right into it. Let's go. Okay, I'm going to do a little stage setting for you. It's February of 1992. The number one song in the nation is To Be With You by Mr. Big. The number one movie in the world? Wayne's World. Kristi Yamaguchi wins U.S. gold for figure skating at the Winter Olympics in France. Ross Perot has just announced on Larry King Live that he's running for president against George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. Now, the main players in our little tale are a 24-year-old woman named Lorie Lance and a 35-year-old man named Claude Garrett. He's a construction worker, and she is a part-time student and waitress at a local's Uno's Pizzeria. The pair live together in a 900-square-foot cinder block kerosene-heated home located at 114 Broadway Street in Old Hickory, Tennessee. I've looked up the location on Google Maps, and it's a pretty grim situation out there. Coincidentally, the house is located right on the perimeter of the Hermitage, former President Andrew Jackson's 1,000-acre estate, located about 10 miles outside of Nashville. I thought about giving you a history of the Hermitage, but it doesn't really play into this very much, so just know that it's tangentially related to this episode. Anyway, Lance and Garrett lived together at the Old Hickory location for a year and a half before the events of this story. The couple, they have a tumultuous relationship. One that the court reports say may have included some domestic assault. There is an MNPD incident report that details an incident of violence, though no formal charges result from it. It should be noted at this point that Lance is considerably younger than Garrett. Like I said just a second ago, she's 24 years old, a student volunteer state, and closing in on graduation in April of 1992. She's described as being a loving and happy person, the kind who's never met a stranger. The night of the fire, Lorie, Claude Garrett, and Lorie's stepfather, Sammy Lane Jones, go for a casual night out at Daisy Mae's, a bar located at 4617 Old Hickory Boulevard. Daisy Mae, it should be noted, is one of my favorite Jason Isbell songs. The bar is now called the Roadside Bar and Grill, but the building in that location apparently still exists. Either way, the trio have a lot to drink, and there's no evidence that the couple have any kind of argument or disagreement whatsoever while they're at Daisy Mae's. They leave sometime after 1 a.m. and get home between then and 3 in the morning. It's not long after that when the fire begins. Sometime around 5 a.m., a fire ignites in the living room of the home. A neighbor, Ruby Alcorn, is awakened by what she would later describe as a commotion. She looks outside to see Garrett jumping and yelling. Ruby then wakes her husband by saying, Michael, Shorty's house is on fire." Shorty, by the way, is what everyone calls Garrett, even though he's a tall and lean guy. The son, 17-year-old Bobby, is already up at 5 a.m., getting ready for his school day. He hears his dog, who rarely barked, followed by a loud boom. At first he worries that the animal has been shot, but his mother's cries about the engulfed house distract him. He does think that there's a gunshot involved, which may play into the story later. Meanwhile, Ruby says she sees Claude dressed but barefoot. He has burns on his face and down one arm. He picks up a lawn chair and starts breaking windows on the house, sending smoke billowing into the air. Ruby would later testify that Claude is crying, saying, Lorie, how did this happen? How did this start?" Claude Garrett then grabs a hose and attempts to put out the fire, but it's no use. When the firefighters arrive at around 5:08 a.m., Claude has to be repeatedly restrained to keep from going inside the house. They manage to extinguish the fire, but due to the low light and extreme amount of smoke, Miss Lance is not found until 5:45 a.m. She's in the utility room at the rear of the home, lying next to a washer and dryer, covered in an assortment of household items. Here is a detail that seems small but is important nonetheless. The door to the utility room at the rear of the house was outfitted with a sliding bolt latch fixed to the exterior door frame, but there's no doorknob or door handle. This will come into play later, so stay tuned on this point. Lorie Lance is rushed to Donaldson Hospital, where the doctors try to revive her, but she is declared dead at 6:36 a.m. Lorie Lance's autopsy reveals second-degree burns on her face, neck, and hands, though she ultimately died of smoke inhalation. The medical examiner, Dr. Gretel Harlan, is not able to determine when Miss Lance suffered the burns. Multiple experts who have assessed the scene have stated that there is a likelihood she received the burns before entering the utility room, but no exact determination could be made. Metro Nashville police detectives David Miller and Mike Rowland arrive on the scene at 6:22 a.m. They interview the Alcorns and go to the hospital to observe Miss Lance's body. Like I said before, she has redness consistent with the burns, but no signs of physical trauma or struggle that might be consistent with murder. While at the hospital, they see Claude Garrett pacing around. They ask him to come to the downtown police station for an interview. Since the doctor had just given the news of Lorie's death to her parents, Claude requests to stay behind with the family. When Detective Rowland tells him it can't wait, Garrett asks if he's under arrest. The detective replies that he is not, and they sit down for the interview. The following narrative from that exchange emerges. Garrett, who smells of alcohol, relays that he and Miss Lance had been drinking at a bar until late the previous night. Upon arriving home at approximately 1 a.m., a little after maybe, they fall asleep separately on a couch and a love seat in the living room. Later, they relocate to the bedroom and continue sleeping. Garrett says he is unsure of which thing awakened him first, the heat or the smoke. But he goes into the living room and finds a raging fire in their home. Garrett states that he went back into the bedroom to wake Miss Lance and then led her toward the front door with him. Here's the part that sounds improbably suspect. He tells the detectives that Lorie breaks free of his grasp and flees toward the back of the house, while Garrett himself escapes through the front door. It just sounds guilty, doesn't it? Sounds like the confession of a man who is making up a story on the spot and doesn't realize how stupid it sounds. Anyway, after the interview, Garrett surrenders his clothing for analysis and then heads back to stay with his neighbors, the Alcorns. Meanwhile, the Nashville Metro Fire Department has already been on high alert leading up to this particular fire. Following a string of suspicious and unsolved fires, the mayor had established a multi-agency arson task force in 1991, I should say rather. It did not pertain only to Davidson County either. The Tennessean would report that the number of arson cases reached historic levels that year. Fire Marshal Investigator Kenneth Porter arrives on the scene at 6:30 a.m. Two things immediately grab his attention. Quote, a strange burn pattern, end quote, running along the front door sill and windows, a hallmark of arson scenes. There's also the strong, unmistakable odor of kerosene. As the fire marshal walks toward the kitchen, the smell becomes more potent. Between the fridge and the back room where Lorie Lance was discovered, Porter finds a 5-gallon plastic container of kerosene, the top melted away. He immediately notices what he later refers to as a, quote, large pour pattern on the living room floor. The firefighters remove the furniture and use a hose to spray the room to reveal the irregular burn patterns. Also, after they clear debris from the living room, they notice a burn pattern that suggests a possible mixed liquid accelerant. I've always been fascinated by the science of fires. How they're able to tell that, it's a case of arson instead of an electrical fire, or a case of arson instead of an accidental fire, or how they know that an accelerant is used. So if you're like me, have been fascinated by it, hang on, we'll get to maybe the science of it a little more in the next episode. But for now, I'm dealing mostly with the facts and what has happened. Okay. Porter, the investigator, will go on to say that this case is a, quote, possible homicide, end quote. And then the lead detective calls the local field division of the ATF, who assigns Special Agent James F. Cooper. After a preliminary investigation, he determines the cause of the fire to have been caused by ignited liquid vapors, likely kerosene, that had been purposefully poured. Okay. Moving back to Claude Garrett. As he exits the downtown police station, Claude Garrett knows he's in trouble. It should be noted that he's no stranger to legal troubles. A middle school dropout, Claude began drinking and committing petty crimes at an early age. At 20 years old, he moved to Indiana and got wrapped up in a marijuana and burglary ring, which is so very late 70s of him. He was arrested for robbery in the spring of 1977, but escaped from jail and went into hiding, committing a series of crimes along the way. After he was caught the second time, he spent the rest of his 20s in jail. He got out in 1986 and then moved back to Tennessee. A few years later, he met Lorie, who was a pretty brunette with aspirations of going into real estate, and he settled down. All of this information, including his past, weigh on him as Claude anticipates the fallout from Lorie's death. And he has a long time to contemplate it. No one is willing to give him a ride back to his charred residence, so he's forced to walk the dozen miles back to his house. And because he has nowhere else to go, he spends the night sleeping in a car in the Alcorns' front yard. He relocates to his aunt's house for the next few days and soon discovers that he's not welcome at Lorie's funeral. It seems as though they've set their minds to thinking that Claude is responsible for her death. So he's forced to visit her grave after the service. And then shortly after that, he skips town on a bus, heading to Hiawatha, Kansas to stay with his mother in the interim, which, of course, also arouses suspicion. Garrett's past and his reputation while drinking, he could be said to be a mean drunk by those who knew him, surround him like a cloud during the ensuing investigation. It doesn't take long for the walls to close in on Claude Garrett, and on June 2nd, 1992, he's arrested in Kansas and then transported to Nashville to face trial for the first-degree murder of Lorie Lance. The tactic for Assistant DA General John Zimmerman is to paint Garrett as a violent drunk who lost control one night. The theory goes that Garrett locked Lance in the utility room and then poured kerosene everywhere before striking a match. Unfortunately, there are a few factual gaps in the state's case. There's no consensus about either the motive for killing Lance, nor is there any real evidence that he was indeed physically abusive. And then there's also the issue of the door lock. I mentioned it earlier that the utility room had a slide latch, but no doorknob, no actual real normal lock. And despite being central to the state's case, the door lock is not introduced as evidence. Only photographs are presented. In addition, only one witness, Fire Captain Otis Jenkins, insists the utility room door had been locked at all. Jenkins himself is an imperfect witness. For instance, he claims to have needed to turn a knob to get into the utility room at all, despite the fact that there was no doorknob. Other witnesses testify for the state as well. Bobby and Michael Acorn imply that Claude Garrett was either unemotional or just putting up a front to appear like he cared about Lorie's welfare. Bobby Alcorn says, this is the kid, quote, "He was trying to act like he was doing something. That's what he was trying to do, trying to put on." The star witness during the trial is ATF agent James Cooper. DA Zimmerman wastes no time putting the agent's resume on the record. Since Cooper had worked such famous cases as the World Trade Center bombing, it would go a long way in determining and establishing his credibility. Cooper walks the jury through his main observations, namely the irregular burn pattern inside the residence. There is a telltale V-shaped pattern indicating the point of origin in the living room near the front door. There's a blanket that seems to have been soaked in kerosene, and, of course, the charring that seems to indicate use of some kind of accelerant. Based largely on the testimony of Agent Cooper, it doesn't take long to reach a verdict. On August 20th, 1993, after 2.5 days of deliberations, the jury finds Claude Garrett guilty of first-degree murder. He is then sentenced to life in prison. And that will just about do it for this episode of Music City Murder. In the next episode, we're going to detail, what happens next. This isn't quite the open and shut case of arson that it appears on the surface, and the one that many people, thousands and thousands of people, thought for 2 decades, 3 decades. So we're going to dig into it, the intervening years from 1993 until about now. It's going to get really interesting, and we're going to dig into the science behind arson a little bit and talk about what actually got Claude Garrett convicted of murder in 1993. Thank you guys for listening. Don't forget to support the show. If you like what you've heard, head on over to iTunes and give us a 5-star review, or wherever your listening choice is, whatever app you use. If you're worried about what to say, don't. Just say you like the show. I don't personally care about the reviews, but every single one of them helps the show's analytics or whatever. I'm not a scientist. I'm smart enough to know when I'm not smart enough to say something. But just go give it a review. We also have a Patreon chock full of episodes not about Nashville. Just head over to patreon.com/Music City Murder to get started. Monthly subscriptions are just $1. For that, you get access to all of the previous shows, as well as those that are coming up. I got in the midst of doing a show about Richard Ramirez, and I plan on concluding that one in the coming days, weeks, or months. And it's a brutal one. It's psychically, that one's difficult to deal with because of just the pure carnage that he leveled upon the city of Los Angeles in 1984 and 1985. So, that said, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time on Music City Murder.